Okay, so we have reached probably our busiest week of the year, which is, unless you're talking about going to Israel, those weeks are pretty busy. But this is the week of the Revive conference in Nashville. And so tomorrow afternoon, we're going to start packing books and things like that to get ready to drive down Wednesday. And so I say that to say it's an extremely busy week. In some ways, it's a very stressful week because there's lots of things on our end that are packed into those days. And so with that in mind, I'm going to try to have the Monday night class as usual next week. What I won't have is probably enough time to prepare for it. So if I feel like I don't have time to properly prepare for it, I'll let you know on Sunday. And what I'll probably do is I'll probably move it to Wednesday night, Tuesday or Wednesday night. I'll pick one of those two. We'll still have class, but we'll just probably have to have it later in the week, simply because I would have to pull out something old probably in order to have it adequately prepared, which, sometimes it's good to do the old stuff. But we'll see how it goes. We'll just, I've got lots of help this year. Most of our congregation is going to Revive also. And so they're going to help me out at the book table, which will be a huge help. And especially a big help in terms of unpacking, carrying, repacking, and that sort of thing. So it may not be as exhausting this year as it has been in years past. So just kind of heads up. I know you usually get your invitation. It usually goes out at 10 a.m. on Sunday. And I would probably still send it out. But if I had edited the meeting time, it would be on the invitation and showing you the proper time that we would meet if I were going to move it to, say, Wednesday, which would give me a chance to recuperate. Okay, so let's get started tonight. And remember, I said last week I got mixed up, and I said I'll have to get back on track. So this week we're going to do the Song of Songs tonight, and then in tomorrow's class we'll do part 2 of the Bilam Balak saga, where we'll break down the curses that Bilam spoke against Israel and try to get to the bottom of what's happening there. Pretty amazing. At any rate, we're going to go back to Song of Songs. And so I'm going to share the screen. And this is the verse that we're working with. It's chapter 2, verse 3. It says, like an apple tree among the trees of the forest, so is my beloved among the young men. In his shade, I took great delight and sat down, and his fruit was sweet to my taste. All right, now what I want to do is back up. Instead of just jumping off, we've had a week in between here to forget what we did last week. And I know I always have, when I do these, I always have to go back and review the week before I can start the teaching for this particular week. So I do want us to go back and remember what was the point. All right. And the point was, as we're talking about the sweetness of the Torah. And this was a midrash we looked at, and I'm going to keep looking at these comparisons between people who will receive the word with gladness and joy, people who will hear the word and do it, versus people who don't receive the word at all. Or the lesson is we're going to go into today is, what if they did receive the word with joy? Yeshua taught us about different types of people. And one of those types of people in his parable was people who do receive it with joy at first. And as we all know, there's all sorts of things that can come in and try to steal the word away from us. And that's what I want to look at today. But I still want to contrast, because we're still going to take a look at the book of Revelation and try to draw some comparisons between the way the Jewish sages viewed the nations versus Israel of the covenant, and how John was viewing it, and see, is it really any different, or is it pretty consistent with what John would have understood about the role of the nations, not who were being incorporated into the covenant, instead the nations who were rejecting the covenant, like Bilam, like Balak, like Amalek, like the Moabites, like the Midianites. So last week when we were looking at this, it said that the divine word would go forth from God at Sinai and take two different forms. For Israel, it was a life-giving medicine, but it was a deadly poison for the nations of the world. That it was a life-giving medicine for Israel is derived from that which is stated, has ever a people heard the voice of God speaking from the midst of the fire as you have heard and lived? Implying that you indeed heard and lived. In other words, it wasn't a given. And the implication is the nations died from it. Now, we're not talking about a literal death. It just means that to them, the word was death. And here's the irony. To Israel, too, it felt like they were dying. They told Moses, you go listen to the rest of it, because if we hear any more, we'll die. But nevertheless, they committed to it. Even though they were having trouble dealing with it, they had already committed to it. And they didn't say, this hurts too much, we don't want to hear anymore. What they said is, Moses, you go listen, and then you come back and tell us, because we're just not yet ready for this death and resurrection of the word. The difference would be that for those among the nations who rejected it, they were rejecting it outright. Okay, so that's a little bit of our context. And then we are told in Psalm 119, 103, how sweet are your words to my taste. Yes, sweeter than honey to my mouth. And so when we receive the word, we can taste its sweetness. We can taste it with joy. But then what happens when it gets down to our bellies? See, when it gets to the belly and the heart are kind of equivalent in ancient literature. So what happens when it gets down into your belly? What if it were to turn bitter? What if it were to actually poison you? Which is what happens with the trial of the sotah. If the woman accused, and she's put on trial and she drinks the bitter water, the words, were washed up into the water. So she's drinking the words. And so the idea there is, if she did commit adultery, then at first, what she did seemed sweet. It seemed enjoyable. But then, as she begins to digest it, as it starts to go through her system, then it's going to poison her. So with the Torah, what we want to do is we want to receive it. We want to receive the sweetness of it. We want it to taste good to us. When they first start teaching children the Aleph Beit, they'll put honey, on in much older times, they would have slates and stuff that they could write on. They would smear honey on there and let them lick the honey off of it, so that the Hebrew letters, their first experience with the Hebrew letters, would be like the taste of honey to their mouths. give them a really good start. But as we saw last week, there's a trial. Once you take the word inside of you, it will put you on trial. And remember, the contrast here was between, is the Torah sweet to your palate? Is it sweet to your taste? Israel, the answer would be yes. However, for the nations who rejected it, they will eventually be given the scroll of the Torah to drink. And if it has the effect, just like the trial of the Sotah is our model for covenant people. But then in Revelation, we see something happening on a worldwide scale. And so John is demonstrating this. He's told, take and eat it. It will make your stomach bitter when he eats the little scroll, which is assumed to be the book of Deuteronomy, Devarim. It's the little scroll, because it's almost a digest of the rest of the Torah. So he took the scroll, ate it in his mouth. It was sweet as honey. But then when he's eaten it, his stomach was made bitter. And they said to me, you must prophesy again concerning many peoples, nations, languages, and kings. And so he's showing how the word can be received with joy at first. It's not an outright rejection, but there's an element of the word that can be taken in, and it'll be sweet at first. There are even elements of the gospel that are sweet at first. But then when you read the full gospel, there's going to be elements of it that you're not going to like. You're not going to want to digest that, because it's going to run counter to your culture. It's going to run counter to your social religion. It's going to run counter to your wokeness, or whatever it is that would rather be the guide of your life than it is written. And so he's saying, okay, now you're going to see the effect on this on the peoples, nations, languages, and kings. Okay, so now we'll move ahead, now that we've kind of got our background. So like an apple tree among the trees of the forest, so was my beloved among the young men. In his shade I took great delight and sat down, and his fruit was sweet to my taste. Okay, the fruit, we're still getting the element of sweetness. And so here's the question, kind of tying in with last week. Why is the Torah so bitter to the nations? Well, this is the pattern. Like I said, there's a parallel pattern with Israel. And it's with, again, like I said, the trial of the Sotah. She's brought into the temple. She's going to drink the bitter water with the words washed off in it, with some of the dust of the temple. And if she's innocent, we know that she will bear children. She will bear fruit. If she's guilty, it's going to poison her belly and her thigh. And it's a parallelism to Babylon the Great is fallen, because that's what happened to her belly and her thigh. The belly will fall and the thigh will fall. And what the rabbis read into this, it's not explicitly stated, but it's the way that it was understood, is because you've got so many doubles in that passage. You know, for instance, the priest says the curses twice. She has to say amen, amen. She has to say it twice. And then her belly and her thigh. The belly will fall, the thigh will fall. They will fall, fall. And so you get a prophecy there, Babylon the Great is fallen, fallen. And their understanding is whatever is happening to her, if she's guilty, is happening to her partner in crime at the exact same time. He could go hide in a closet. It's not going to help, because she has the right of refusal, not him. And so if she's on a suicide mission and she decides to drink the bitter water and she already knows she's guilty, then her belly which is the place of reproduction, it's going to fall. And for the male, his place of reproduction is going to fall as well. Remember, the thigh is a euphemism for the male organ. It's the place of the testimony, like Abraham said, put your hand under my thigh and swear to me. So it's the place of reproduction. So for the adulterous woman and her partner, their reproductive organs will fail. They will fall, they will fail. So we've got the idea here that this adulterous woman, because she's a member of the covenant people, she knows the Torah. She knows the Big Ten. And if she knows the Big Ten, she's really without excuse. And, you can receive the word, but if it doesn't go into your heart, and again, here it's being illustrated by the belly. But if it's not going into your heart, it's not going to take a deep root. So why is the Torah so bitter to the nations? Something very similar is happening in the book of Revelation. And we know Yeshua taught that the seed of the word would sometimes spring up very quickly, but the soil that it fell on was shallow. It would just quickly wither and die. And in Mark 13:20, he says, the one sown with seed on the rocky places, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet he has no firm root in himself, but is only temporary. And when affliction or persecution occurs because of the word, immediately he falls away. All right, so a covenant person who grew up in the covenant has had many more opportunities for that root of the seed to go down and to spread out and to become firm. But for somebody the danger for somebody that's being exposed to the word for the first time, or they haven't heard it much before, often what you can see, even in the letters, the epistles that the apostles were writing to different congregations, you could see that many of them, they had quickly received the word, they had received the gospel. But you can tell by the things they're doing that some of them didn't develop firm roots because they're doing crazy stuff. There's drunkenness, there's incestuous relationships, there's all sorts of things happening in these congregations, which tells you that they receive the word with joy, but they never put down good roots. And then when they're tempted, they're going to fall away. Again, it's just like the belly and the thigh, they will fall. It's the same thing. They can receive the word with joy. They can receive it with great passion. But unless they get right to work establishing firm roots, then when affliction comes, when persecution comes, they're going to fall away. And so I looked up the Hebrew cognate to where Yeshua is saying they fall away or fallen away. Again, it's scandalizo. That's a word we've worked with before. It's bait. It's a trap. It's a snare. And in the study, I think it was in workbook 4, we talked about the difference between the spirit and the soul, and how if the adversary wants to trap you, the bait is going to have to be something that your soul loves or craves. And that's going to be the danger for somebody who has just received the word. Because what will come is affliction or persecution. In Hebrew, that's tza'ah or vetzara. And you can see they've got the same roots there. But he's saying that a little bit of pressure will make them forget from their heart, which is interesting. And that's actually from the Hebrew Matthew. I like to go back to see, well, if Yeshua had said this in Hebrew, what would he be saying? So I use the Shem Tov Matthew, and he says, when they experience a little tsa'ar or betzara, then they're going to forget from their heart the word that they heard. And that's kind of the risk there. For some people, the big 10 bring more affliction or persecution than they want to handle. They have trouble with just, the big 10. But we know there's not only 10. There's 613. There's an entire Torah that addresses many details that the big 10 do not. You've got the big 10, and then the rest are going to go into one of those 10 categories. It's not so hard to get people to receive the 10 words with joy. In fact, tradition says that when the 10 commandments went out at Sinai, they went all the way around the world and came back. And because they were offered to the 70 nations, each in their own language. And they said among every nation, there was a remnant who would agree to accept the 10 words. But there wasn't a majority like Israel, where the whole nation said, we will do and we will hear. And so if all you heard was the 10 words, the 10 commandments, it would be pretty easy to receive it with joy and sweetness, because they're very logical. There's nothing really in the 10 words that's illogical. The Sabbath day, we might dispute that, whether it's logical or not, because remember, it's not in a logical class of commandments. It's not one of the mishpatim. It's more of edah. It's a testimony to the creation, that you believe the creation, that Adonai rested on the seventh day, and so forth. But even at that, even if believers sometimes don't know what day of the week the Shabbat is on, they'll typically agree with you that there is such a thing as a Shabbat. And it's logical to them that there should be a rest day once per week. And so they see the 10 commandments often as something that's logical, because it creates social security. It deals quite a bit with your relationship with your neighbor. And if you would just do those 10 commandments, then you would have a pretty stable society. Your goods would be safe, your marriage would be safe, your children would be safe, your parents would be safe. So that part, who wouldn't like it, other than the people who don't? I know we're in a crazy period right now. But the rest of the Torah, it's not always logical. So you can receive the big 10 with joy, but you and I know, as we start studying the rest of the commandments, that you're going to start to have questions, because the longer you study and the farther you work in the Torah, the more you run into things that really aren't cut and dried. They require study in order to apply them, to understand them, to figure out, does this apply to me right now? Does this apply to somebody else? Is this for another time? Is this for another place? Is this only when there's a temple in existence and a Levitical priesthood? When do these things apply? And the farther you get into it, the more you're liable to become confused, because so many of the commandments, as you start working through that, they're not logical. And so that joy that you initially received, will you sustain the joy, is the question, as you start working through things where you don't feel like you're on as firm a foundation with your understanding. And this is a very dangerous stage. When people first really start studying more than the Big 10, when they really start getting into the commandments, they really need mentoring. They really need pastoring. They really need encouragement. because in this danger zone, we don't want to say they're getting over their heads, but they really are. Because it requires, this is why there's gifts within the body. This is why we have teachers. This is why we have pastors. This is why we have evangelists. This is why we have apostles. Because on our own, we're very vulnerable to falling away. So again, I went back to the Hebrew Matthew. I wanted more clarity as to what Yeshua was saying. He says, the person who receives it with gladness, but when a little bit of trouble comes, it says he is without root and is in mekaveh, is the Hebrew word. I'm more used to hearing this in the context of buche, which is crying. This particular form, it means confusion or whining. It can also mean crying. What happens when you're confused? You start whining. What happens when nobody listens to you whining? You'll start crying. So yeah, it's kind of all in the same bundle. You can see where the root of it can mean all of these things: confusion, whining, and crying. And so when a little bit of testing or trouble comes, when somebody encounters the word, they can fall into a state of confusion. I'm not sure what it means. They can start whining, or they can start crying. But he's saying that once you enter in this stage, there's really only one thing that will sustain you through it. Because as we look at the Israelites, they are prime examples of what happens during the shallow root stage. And I don't know how many of you are gardeners, but if you're a gardener, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Let's say you planted your corn and your corn started to come up, and then you had this terrible storm where it was just raining buckets and it just washes out that top level of soil. And that's when you really notice how shallow the roots of the corn are at that stage of their growth. They haven't had time to really go down and root them. And I've seen my garden after a storm, when the corn is fairly young, the entire garden will just lay over sideways on the ground because it's in a shallow root stage at that time. It's very vulnerable. Now, over the next day or two, most of those will stand back up, assuming that the weather improves. But that kind of gives us an idea. When people first get into the Torah, and this is why we have to be really careful, we want lots of people to come into the Torah with us, and then we start complaining because not enough people are, and then we say, well, you know what, if they did, who would coach all the people through it? Because you do go into a pretty intense stage. Once you get past the joy stage, you will go through a period of confusion and whining. And the only thing that sustains during this stage is to keep putting the roots down. That's what gets you through this stage. The roots have to go deeper and deeper. And this is why I urge people, please, yes, we want you to learn the Torah at your level. Jacob said, I go at the pace of the nursing children, but those children eventually grew up and they could take much longer journeys. That's the danger, is when you're studying Torah, you want to feel competent. You don't want to feel like you're over your head. You don't want to feel dumb. No human being wants to feel dumb. And so what we will do is we will adjust what we're learning to all that we can understand, but we don't want to really be challenged with things that are still difficult to understand, that will take us into that stage of confusion, which could lead to whining. But it is saying it's okay. The more you put your roots down at this stage, the easier it's going to be for you to continually tackle deeper and deeper and deeper things. And you won't be afraid of these stages of confusion. It won't lead to whining. You'll just realize, okay, I'm on another cycle now. I understand this stage because I'm actually at a higher level than I was before. I'm at a higher level because my roots are at a lower level. And like I say, it won't just lay the whole garden over when a storm goes through. But if it does, it'll pop right back up again the next day because the roots are starting to go down. It's not temporary. But this confusion and whining stage, if it lasts indefinitely, now we've got a real problem. It's not a stage where the person is putting down, it's seeking deeper roots in order to stabilize. Instead, because it's scary, you don't feel competent. People sometimes don't want to put those roots down. They want a 5-minute video. They want an inspirational Facebook post. They want easy reading. Don't make me think too hard. And I'm like, well, if you're not going to think too hard about the Torah, what in the world would you think hard about? Because there's nothing else in this world that's going to help you put your roots down and give you depth and give you permanence. And so what believers, not just the world, of course, the world is looking for this, but even among the community of believers, people are looking for others in their community who have roots, who have depth, who have permanence in their faith. They're not up this week and down the next, up this week and down the next, or they're not just manic, involved in things, and then they'll fall away for a while, and then they'll come back, and then they'll fall away for a while, and then they'll be off, who knows where they'll go. Again, still pursuing the things that make them feel competent. They're not willing to say, wait a minute, I'm feeling some confusion right here. I feel like I'm out of my depth. I don't like the challenge. I don't understand 100% of what I'm reading. I'm like, well, that's okay. That's the beauty of the Bible, is as long as you live, it will be a new thing to you if you keep reading it. And so that's that opportunity. So, I'm in confusion right now. And it's like Yeshua is saying, put your roots down. Put your roots down. Keep putting your roots down. And so what will uproot you at this stage is your emotions, because emotions are impermanent. Remember, emotion, it comes from the soul, from the nefesh. It's appetite, emotion, desire, and intellect. See, when your intellect is challenged and you feel like you don't know as much as everyone else, then it's harder to sustain because it's an ego thing. And your intelligence is saying, hey, wait a minute, go over here with this group that you know more than, and it'll make you feel good. Because you'll feel like a success if you go over here with this group. But you know what? This group is not challenging you. This group is not taking you deeper. This group is not guiding you through the confusion and whining stage so that you will put down deeper roots. And then what we're seeing is now going to go taller. It's going to grow more fruit. The only way you put that root down is when you quit relying on emotions, which are impermanent, and you start relying on it is written, which is permanent. That's the deep shoresh. That's the deep root. And that's the only thing that will sustain you through the dangerous stage. That's the only thing that's going to make, that corn last till the end of the harvest, until it makes a full ear. And so just to give you an example of what we're talking about, when we talk about a root, we're talking about something that's stable, something that's not going to move around. It's only going to grow greater or stronger, but it's not unstable. You can move plants around by the roots, but it's not recommended to do a lot of it. So when we're learning Hebrew, which is the unconfused language of the world, one of the first things you learn to do is to identify the shoresh, or the root stem of verbs. And so when that happens, and I know this from experience, even when I encounter a new word, an unknown word, and I don't know what that word is, if I can look at that word, and I might have to toss out some letters that I know are prefixes or suffixes or prepositions or vowels, once I toss out those things that aren't part of the shoresh, this 2 or 3 letter root, then I can almost guess, and in some cases guess correctly, what this word actually means, because it has a permanence. It might change from adjective to adverb to noun to different tenses of the verb, but the root itself is going to keep me grounded in the general sense of this new word. And here's an example for you to look at. This is with the verb lichtov, which means to write. And that's the infinitive, lichtov, to write. But the shoresh, and you can see here the different verb tenses. You can see the present tense, you can see past, you can see future. And if you look at all of those, past or future, you can see in every single, you can see the root. You can see the shoresh. And the shoresh, or the root of lichtov, is kaf, tav, vet. So it'd be katav. And typically your masculine past tense will be the shoresh itself, katav. So let's say I ran into any of these other words or verb tenses right here. If I can pick out those 3 letters of the root, then I know that it's something about writing. And then from this, you can also say, like, if you want to make a noun, okay, if your shoresh is katav, a letter is going to be michtav, michtav. All you do is add a mem to it, and you can make a noun. And that's what I mean about rooting. If the Hebrew language, it's the prime example of being rooted and grounded, because it doesn't move around. No matter what new words you make off of the root is still the same. And so the new words that you make up will always have a root in Hebrew. Let's see, I'm trying to think of a modern word. Machshav, I believe. Okay, from you there you get chashav, which is to think. Okay, machshav is a computer. It's a thinker. It thinks for you. So they just took the shoresh and made a modern word out of it that still tells you the essence of what a computer does. It's like a little brain that I don't know if it's helping us or not. And if you look at the 7 types of verbs in Hebrew, you can see here on the menorah pattern that they hold their patterns. And if you learn those 7 patterns, and each of those 7 patterns, it has a music. They teach you the music of that particular verb. And then once you learn all 7 musics, then if you run into a new verb, then you'll know how to conjugate that new verb, because there's only 7 kinds. And so that's why you start with the shoresh. That's why you start training your eye early in Hebrew to find the shoresh. because that's the root of the word. And if I encounter something new and confusing, I can always go back to the Shoresh. And I still may not completely understand what this new word is, but I know what its essence is because I'm rooted and grounded. The word itself is rooted and grounded. And so you put down the root and then you start to get the fruit eventually. But between putting down the root and bearing fruit, there are those danger stages where you might be easily uprooted when you fall into confusion. And that's why I tell people all the time, never make a decision in the heat of the day that will wait until the cool of the evening. Never make a decision in the heat of the day that will wait until the cool of the evening. When you start feeling pressure, that's what Yeshua was, the words he was using, tzara. It's a pressure. Tribulation is like to be pressed and squeezed. And that's how the adversary works. He'll start squeezing you. Make a decision now. Make a decision now. That's how high pressure salesmen work. Make a decision now. This car may not be here if you come back in 15 minutes. You need to sign right here, right now. Well, you're going to sign for something you can't afford, or that it's not really what you were looking for to begin with. You needed a Jeep, not a Cadillac. But that's what the pressure does. The pressure is applied. You go into a state of confusion, and in order to resolve the confusion quickly, you'll just make a decision quickly. But it's liable to be an unrooted decision. So let's go back and let's look at the Israelite example of what can happen that would steal your fruit. Numbers 5:27 says, when he has made her drink the water, then it will come about, if she has defiled herself and has been unfaithful to her husband, that the water which brings a curse will go into her and cause bitterness, and her belly will swell up and her thigh will shrivel. See that bitterness right there? Keep that filed away. You'll need that in just a second. The curse will go into her. The word, the actual commandment will go into her and cause bitterness. And her belly will swell up and her thigh will shrivel, and the woman will become a curse among her people. But if the woman has not defiled herself and is clean, she will be immune and conceive children. She will conceive fruit. She will be fruitful. Now match that with what Yeshua is saying in Matthew 13:33. He says, the one sown with seed on the good soil. Okay, this is her husband. She has received the seed of her husband. This is the good soil. This is the one who hears the word and understands it. In other words, there's roots there. There's firmness there. There's no confusion. She hears the word and she understands it. And when she understands it, she'll bear fruit and produce. And so now we see who the woman is. The woman is Israel. And she has received the seed of the word from her husband. And if she receives the word of her husband, she hears it and she understands it. She knows what to do. Her roots are deep within her covenant. Then she will begin to bear fruit and produce it. Same thing with the woman on trial. If she is indeed receiving the seed of her husband, she's being faithful. She's received that word or that seed of the word. She's understood it because she has put down roots. Then she will begin to bear fruit. But we can also see if the woman Israel, instead she's receiving someone else's seed. And what's being sown now in her life is going to be confusion. Now that things are confused, there's no firmness, there's no singleness of mind, there's nothing established here. And what's going to happen, there's shallow roots here. She's not hearing, she's not understanding, and one will come along who will very quickly uproot her, because she will commit actions based on I feel rather than it is written in my covenant. So hearing the word, obeying it, and understanding it, they go together. They don't always go at the same time. But understanding has to develop for your roots to go down. Now, just because you understand a passage of Torah does not mean you know why. Remember, there's a class of commandments called the Chukim. You won't always know why, but you can understand the how. You can ask questions about it. You can dig out the shorashim. You can dig down to the Hebrew roots of the words. You can do context studies from the roots of the word. You can do first mention of the root of the word. You can do complete mention of the root of the word. You can put down deep roots as it concerns that particular commandment. And the more you put those roots down in your heart, it's going to get rid of the confusion. And just, FYI, when somebody's really busy, they don't have a lot of time to whine about things. And I think we become whiny. Remember, that's a stage, Yeshua said. You can go into a whiny stage. When you get confused, you'll start whining. And that's just natural human behavior, by the way. But he's saying, don't let that discourage you. You go back to the thing you do understand. You start engaging in this deep root study instead of topic hopping, which is what you will do when you become confused and whiny. So this is too hard. I don't want to search this out. I don't understand how to search this out. I'm too old. I can't tell the difference between a kaf and a beit anymore. It's my vision. We come with all sorts of excuses as to why we don't want to do the deep study. But that's what goes with the whole Torah. You might be able to get away with some shallow roots if you're just sticking with the Big 10. You can probably exist with much shallower roots. But when you get into the full Torah, you have to be alert as to your stages when you go into confusion and whininess. It tells you that you're probably at a growth stage. You say, oh my gosh, I don't want to be shallow. Well, you're not shallow. You're simply putting down another level of roots, but you're still going to go through that stage. You're still going to go like, I don't know anything. And cheer up, that gets worse. The more Torah you learn, the more you wake up every morning and feel like you don't know the first thing about the Bible. And you're like, oh, wow. But then what do? You do what Yeshua would want you to do. You study anyway. When you're feeling whiny and confused, you put down deeper roots. You don't say, well, let me just kind of chill out and go over here and study something simple. That's what I love about Rabbi Foreman's cartoons. They're simple, but they can help you put down some deep roots at the same time. And they're very systematic in the Torah portions. So rather than just turning the internet on and letting the internet guide your study, instead, you stay on task, you stay on topic, you stay in the Torah portions. And you guys have seen, if you'll stay in the Torah portions, then books like Revelation will get clearer and clearer. Daniel gets clearer and clearer. The Gospels get clearer and clearer. What's happening? You don't realize it because a root grows very slow. You may not realize it, but what has happened is you have been putting out very deep roots. And so maybe a passage in the Gospels or Revelation that 10 years ago you would have read it and would have been very confused by it or just had a limited understanding of it. Now you've got deep roots because you have the fuller context. And the Israelites are our example. What happened to most of them in the wilderness? Well, it became bitter. See, as they started to live it out, it became a bitter thing. They were, oh, great joy, we will hear. But see, in the heat of the day, in the pressures of the day, they found out they were rootless. Just like the easy way out. Moses, you go tell. you go listen and you come back and tell us, right? And so putting down deep roots, there's our example with Israel. They saw the 10 words at Sinai. They saw it in thunder. They saw it in lightning. They saw it in hail. They saw it in rain. They saw it in smoke. They saw it in cloud. They just had trouble seeing it in their own lives and their own tribulations. Like Yeshua said, when the trouble comes, when you're a little bit hungry, when you're a little bit thirsty, when the enemy's out there, when your appetites start calling for different things, that's when you need the deep roots, because those days will come. We receive the thunder and lightning of the Torah. It's the days after where we have to guard our hearts, because it will bring a death, but it also will bring about a resurrection. And so if this is true of Israel, then how much more will the nations struggle to put down their roots? Because they really are disconnected. They're, in many cases, extremely disconnected from the deep study that really is necessary to sustain them through day-to-day life. And there's a little bit of a difference here. If you look at the adulteress in the trial of the Sotah, she's an Israelite. But in Revelation, we read about a harlot, a prostitute, who's riding the scarlet beast. And so they're interchangeable in many ways, but there's a slight difference between the two. One is married. She has a husband. She was planted with his word, but she has begun to add another seed. Typically, and now we're looking at the nations, they have no husband. In ancient times, we might say, well, that maybe they had husband, but maybe it was the Baals, maybe it was the idols. But she has no covenant relationship. She doesn't have the protection of a husband. And so she's going to be carrying multiple seeds from multiple relationships. And so while both types of people are promiscuous, the harlot is going to struggle much more because she's less rooted. It's much harder for her to know how to repent than the adulteress who knows her husband is going to return at the appointed time. Proverbs 7:20. Remember the adulterous woman? She knows exactly when her husband will be back, and so she's timing it. So it shows you kind of two pictures of how the struggle for the nations in many ways can be much more difficult, because there was nothing to help them put down roots to begin with. Now, the woman who has put down some roots and nevertheless seeks out an adulterous partner, that's pretty heavy. In either case, we have examples where both of them are going to have to drink the bitter water, the adulteress and the harlot. They're going to have to drink the words from Mount Sinai. And I don't know, with the harlot nations that it's talking about in Revelation, maybe they'll just be judged according to the 10 words. And then they'll be expected to put down some roots. I don't know. I'm not God's list maker. I'm not their judge. But at any rate, Israel is a nation who has accepted more than 10 words. They agreed to the whole Torah. They said, all that he has spoken, we will do. And so they had to learn the rest of the Torah over the wilderness journey. They're likening, as we get into Song of Songs, chapter 3, verse 4, they will talk about bringing the beloved to my mother's house. And that's considered to be the Mishkan, where the Holy Spirit dwells. And so they have Moses to teach them the Torah with the presence dwelling among them. And so they had a heavier expectation. I mean, they're getting it right from Moses' mouth. They witnessed the thunder and the lightning. They needed to put down roots or they were going to die. And some did, and some didn't. But either way, whether you're looking at the nations, they're going to have to put down roots. Israel's going to have to put down roots. They're all going to have to study and do and understand what they have read. Because if they don't, they will be rootless. And very quickly that word will just disappear. And so where it says, his fruit is sweet to my taste, the Midrash says this is kind of the afterglow that the Israelites experienced after receiving the Torah. Because in the 12 months that they built the Mishkan in front of Mount Sinai, they have Moses passing on to them the fullness. He's passing on them the whole 5 books, not just the big 10 commandments. So it's also through the stories. It's through the history. It's through everything. It's through all 613 commandments of the Torah from Genesis to Deuteronomy. And they're experiencing this depth of the Torah with sweetness. And they seem to have this unique little window here where they dwelled in unity while they built the tabernacle. And so as they're putting down these roots, then what are they doing? It's because they're partaking of his fruit. So as he nourishes them and sustains them, then they can begin to develop the roots. The next question is going to be, was it really rooted in their hearts? Or were they like we were when we went to those classes we really didn't enjoy? Like health class? Everybody had to take health class in 10th grade. And I listened as little as I possibly could and still make the right grade. I was not developing roots in that health class. I thought it was a waste of time. I was an athlete. I already know this stuff, right? But we've all had those classes we went to, and we just did what we had to do to get by, but we never developed roots in that topic, in that subject. And that was going to be the test afterward. Once the Mishkan starts picking up and moving, they're going to start developing some trouble and tribulation. And the question is, will they be confused? Or will what they've put down be uprooted? So let's look again. We're contrasting Israel, a covenant people who would take the whole of the Torah, which gives them a much better root system, we might say, than the nations. And what we want to look at is what the Midrash says about it. It says, of course, Israel receives the sweetness of the fruit. of the Torah. But alternatively, it said, to the palate of the other nations of the world, it was bitter as wormwood. And so where do we first hear this? Deuteronomy 29:18. Moses is exhorting them to keep the Torah. He says, so that there will not be among you a man or woman, a family or tribe, whose heart turns away today from the Lord our God to go serve the gods of those nations, that there will not be among you a root bearing poisonous fruit and wormwood. In other words, if there's a root at all, it's so shallow. It's going to yield poisonous fruit and wormwood. Because remember, the tree in Scripture represents a human being. So he says, don't be a person who not only is shallow and rootless, but what you are bearing is the fruit of wormwood. In other words, don't let the Torah become distasteful to you like it is to the nations of the world. And then Proverbs 5:1-6, my son, pay attention to my words, incline your ear to my understanding, so that you maintain discretion. Okay, and that Hebrew word there for discretion, it means a thoughtful, purposeful plan made with good counsel. Now, it can also mean the other kind. It can mean an evil plan made with counsel. But in the context, we see what it's saying. A thoughtful, purposeful plan made with good counsel. In other words, it's rooted so that you may maintain a rooted, purposeful plan, and your lips may comply with knowledge. For the lips of an adulteress drip honey, and her speech is smoother than oil, but in the end, she is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death, her steps take hold of Sheol. She does not ponder the path of life. Her ways are unstable, she doesn't know it. Right, another example, when it goes in, it's sweet like honey. And at that point, it's just like the words of the Torah. It's sweet to our taste. It's like honey. How will we know whether we've developed a healthy root in the Torah or whether all the root we have is death? And you can do that. That's the idea of giving us the example of an adulteress. She has a husband. She has a covenant. But the seed she's taking in is not his. It's like the Torah, but it isn't the Torah. And in the end, she's bitter as wormwood. And her ways are unstable. She doesn't even know it. She's rootless. She's confused. And she doesn't even know it. And that's the problem. When we're rootless and we're confused, a lot of times we don't even know where we are. We don't know what the problem is. We just know we're confused and whiny, but we don't really know why. So that takes us to Revelation 8:8-11. It says, the second angel sounded, and something like a great mountain burning with fire, think Mount Sinai and the Torah, was hurled into the sea, which is the nations, and a third of the sea became blood, and a third of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. The third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of waters. The star is named Wormwood, and a third of the waters became wormwood. and many people died from the waters because they were made bitter. All right, so now we're not really talking about Israel and the trial of the Sotah. Now we're seeing it's expanded to the nations. The sea is the nations. And now they are also having to drink the water. And it's going to expose them. Because if they followed the way of the adulterous woman, it says in the end, she's bitter as wormwood. She does not ponder the path of life. Her ways are unstable. She doesn't know it. Now, in Revelation, the nations are going to have to drink this water. And if they have, again, been taking in bad seeds, then they're going to be exposed. It's going to expose them because of the wormwood. And they're going to die because that's what it says right here. She does not ponder the path of life. Her feet go down to death. Her steps take hold of Sheol. And so we've kind of got parallel tracks right here. We have a message to Israel, the people of the covenant. And she's in danger too. Because she knows more about her husband than, say, the harlot, who was very promiscuous. She doesn't have a covenant. She doesn't have a husband. The end result is the same. It's rootless confusion. If the person does not study to show himself or herself approved, it's a danger zone. And so for all of us, what do we do when we feel like we're in confusion or we're whining? And we should all go through these stages from time to time. Then just look around, because our Torah portion this week provides encouragement. You know, even Moses and Aaron sat around crying at the sin of Baal Peor. And that's been a wonder of the ages for me. Like, why were Moses and Aaron just sitting there crying and letting these people do what they're doing right in front of them? Finally, Pinchas gets up and he drives a spear through their reproductive organs. And his name means bronze mouth. In other words, this is not a rootless guy. Pinchas has learned from Moses, and his roots went deep. And when the situation presented itself, he stepped up. And he knew how to tap into the roots of the word with zeal. He knew what to do in that situation. He didn't sit around whining and crying. He stepped up with the word because that word had put down such deep roots. It says in Numbers 25:6, behold, a man of the children of Israel came and brought the Midianite woman near to his brothers before the eyes of Moses and before the entire assembly of the children of Israel, and they were weeping at the entrance of the tent of meeting. All right, so there's going to be those times. If it happened to Moses and Aaron, if they sat around and cried and got whiny when they were presented with a new tribulation, we can't think that we will master every tribulation without falling into some confusion and whining. But what will sustain us? Deep roots. If we put down those tap roots and we surround ourselves with people like Pinchas, who are always going to speak the word. It's not going to change with Pinchas. It doesn't change with the situation. We're going to have those people around us who will keep speaking the truth and who will see through the confusion. And these are people who can inspire us. There was the tribe, was it Issachar? It said they knew the times. They knew what to do. And the deeper our roots go in the Torah, the more we can help one another. When we see our neighbor struggling, and we see that they're going through a stage of confusion or whininess in their walk, then we can be that Pinchas for them. We can come alongside and say, look, I know you're discouraged right now. I know this is a tribulation. I know this is the last thing you wanted to see. This is the last thing you wanted to experience right now. But the word doesn't change. No matter what's going on in your life right now, the word doesn't change. No matter how you're feeling right now, if you feel like, you know what, as much as I know about the Torah, why do I feel so incompetent? Why can't I handle these situations that come up in my life? Well, don't beat yourself up too much. Moses and Aaron didn't master every situation. They needed help sometimes. And so if you feel yourself in that stage of confusion and whininess, make sure that you have surrounded yourself with people who can be your Pinchas, who can say the word never changes. What you're going through right now, I understand why you're heartbroken. I understand. But his word will not change. Your feelings will change. And you're going to master a new level out of this tribulation. That's what's happening right now. You feel like you're sliding backwards, and the truth is, the only backward there is roots going deeper, feeding in this deep soil, so that at the proper time, out of that tribulation, you're going to bear fruit, because you might be the only person in the next situation who can speak into it like Pinchas, because you went through the tribulation that you just went through, and you thought you failed that test. I got confused. I got whiny. I got cry-fied, as my Aunt Dane used to say. It's okay if you get cry-fied. He's changing you. You're getting deeper roots. And then the next situation where somebody has, and you can say, you know what, I just went through something like that recently. And guess what? I know you're feeling awful, but his word's not going to change. Keep studying. Go deeper. Go deeper. Go deeper in his word, because these things will sustain us. And that's why it's so necessary to have that community. Don't seek out the community that makes you feel smart. Seek out the community that's going to sustain you when you're not smart. Seek out that community that's going to help you move through these kind of dangerous confusion stages, because the illusion is, I'm not doing so well. And the truth is, you're doing very well. You're going through your stage so that you can grow. So cut yourself a little slack. You're in pretty good company. If you've been cry-fied, if you felt like you weren't getting anywhere, it's probably just that the growth is getting deeper and you haven't seen the result above the ground yet. But it will come in its time. Trust me, it'll come in its time. And it'll come, there will be a time of tribulation. And then you will realize how deep that root went and how necessary that last tribulation was, because you're going to just jump over this one with flying colors.